60 million people worldwide are living with atrial fibrillation, a terrible heart condition that increases your risk of stroke by a massive 500%, as well, of course, as heart attacks and heart failure. But what if something as simple as vitamin D tablets could reduce that risk? Well, that's exactly what a recent study out of Finland aimed to explore, and today we're diving into the findings. We'll break down what the study found, what of course it means for you, and how you can make sure that your vitamin D levels are where they need to be to reduce your risk. I'm Dr Suresh Khirwadkar, a specialist GP and board-certified lifestyle physician with over 20 years of experience in the medical field, and I've seen firsthand how common and impactful vitamin D deficiency can be, not just for heart health, but for overall wellness. And I'm not just speaking as a doctor here. I've also had my own personal struggles with low vitamin D, both when I was living in the UK and here in Australia where I live now. Now you'd think the Sunshine State, where I live, Queensland, the sunshine would make deficiency very rare, but actually it's not the case. Here in Australia, campaigns like Slip Slop Slap, designed to protect us from skin cancer, have left many people avoiding the sun entirely. While the campaign has been relatively successful in reducing skin cancer rates, it's also contributed to widespread vitamin D deficiency. It's an unintended consequence that I've seen many times over. Now, this study, published in the American Heart Journal in 2023, is looking at the possible benefit of vitamin D supplementation on this particular condition called atrial fibrillation. Before we get any further into the study though, we need to first understand what atrial fibrillation actually is. Atrial fibrillation, or AF as it's known, is the most common type of irregular heart rhythm, especially in older adults. It occurs when the electrical signals in the heart's upper chambers, called the atria, become chaotic, causing the heart to beat irregularly and inefficiently. Instead of contracting in a nice, coordinated way, like squeezing a sponge, they quiver, vibrate, or flutter, which can cause the blood to pool or go in the wrong direction. It's like just getting the sponge and squishing it. The pooling increases the risk of blood clots forming, which can then travel to the brain and cause an ischemic stroke. It's called ischemic because the clot blocks the blood flow to the brain. And that's why people with atrial fibrillation are 5 times more likely to suffer a stroke, and those strokes are often more severe and disabling than other types of strokes. Atrial fibrillation can also make it harder for the ventricles to pump blood effectively, leading to symptoms like fatigue, shortness of breath, and chest pain. And while AF, or atrial fibrillation, is more common as we age, it's not just limited to older adults. Younger and younger people with conditions like high blood pressure, obesity, or sleep apnea are also at an increased risk. Why is this a big deal though? Well, as I said, AF isn't just some annoying flutter in your chest. It really does increase the risk of serious complications like strokes, heart failure, and premature death. In fact, people with AF, as I've said, are 5 times more likely to suffer a stroke, and they are probably going to be more severe than those caused by other factors. AF also comes with a significant impact on quality of life. Symptoms like palpitations, fatigue, and shortness of breath can make even everyday activities seem very challenging. And as I said, it's not just a condition for the elderly anymore. It's more common as we age, but younger and younger adults are developing AF, particularly if they have those other risk factors. Just like everything else as well, it seems to be getting more and more common in younger and younger people. Now, over the years, research has explored many potential factors that contribute to atrial fibrillation, and vitamin D deficiency has continuously emerged as a possible factor. Observational studies, I know they're not great, but bear with me, has suggested a link between vitamin D levels and the risk of AF, but until now, there's been pretty limited evidence from randomized control trials to actually confirm whether this is actually correct. Now, observational studies are often poo-pooed, but there are some advantages to them, like they're cheap, they're easier to do, they don't require as much intervention. You can look at large, diverse populations and look at broad trends across these. They are far easier and far less expensive to conduct than randomized control trials, and they're useful for generating hypotheses about potential relationships, but they can't define causation. Correlation, yes, but not causation. Just because two factors are linked doesn't mean that one necessarily causes the other. So, for example, people with low vitamin D levels might also have an overall poorer health or other risk factors for atrial fibrillation, as we've already mentioned some of them, which could explain the connection. Factors like diet, physical activity, genetics, and pre-existing heart conditions might also influence both vitamin D levels and atrial fibrillation risk, making it difficult to isolate the role of vitamin D here. So, what were the actual findings of this study? Well, first off, the Finnish vitamin D trial was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. This is considered the absolute gold standard and epitome of research design. They followed just under 2,500 healthy men aged 60 and over, and also postmenopausal women aged 65 and over 5 years. Just under 2,500 people in total. This is quite a reasonable number, especially for a randomized control trial. What they found during the 5-year follow-up was very interesting. The group receiving 1,600 international units a day of vitamin D3 had a 27% lower risk of AF compared to the placebo group. The group receiving 3,200 units a day had a 32% lower risk of AF. Pretty big. When the two groups were combined, there was a 30% overall risk reduction in AF compared to placebo. So, how significant were these results? Did the trial show a dose-response relationship? Well, yes, actually they did, meaning that higher doses of vitamin D were associated with greater reductions in AF risk. We'll come back to criticisms of the study later in the episode. What were the incidence rates? Well, AF was diagnosed in 2.29 people per 100 person years in the placebo group. This dropped to 1.72 in the 1,600 unit group and 1.61 in the 3,200 unit group. And by the way, if you're not sure what a person year is, it's a fairly standard unit of measurement used in medical and epidemiological research to account for both the number of people in the study and the time that they were in the study as well. It helps researchers standardize results when participants are followed for different lengths of time, or maybe when the study spans, several years or even potentially decades. So, what makes this study useful or indeed unique? Well, it stands out for a couple of reasons. Number one, it tested 2 different doses of vitamin D, allowing the researchers to assess and basically prove a dose-response relationship rather than just a single dose of vitamin D. Number 2, it tracked AF diagnoses using objective national registry data rather than relying on self-reported outcomes, which studies often do and often draws heavy criticism. And 3, unlike some other trials, the participants already had sufficient baseline vitamin D levels, suggesting that supplementation might provide additional benefits even when deficiency isn't present. In other words, these patients were not actually vitamin D deficient to start with, but they wanted to see if supplementation could still help. So, why should you care? What does this mean for you guys? Well, the findings suggest that daily vitamin D supplementation, particularly at higher doses at 3,200 units, could help to reduce the risk of developing atrial fibrillation. You could supplement either with 1,600 or 3,200 units, or, and I'd recommend this instead, simply get more sunshine. This is where we get the vast majority of our vitamin D from. However, that's my words, not the study. This is not what the study actually looked at, so I can't say for sure that more sunshine is going to give you the same effect. And this is perhaps a major flaw in the study. Actually, maybe that's a good time to talk about the limitations of the study. So number 1, no consideration of sunlight exposure. The study focused exclusively on vitamin D supplementation and its effects on AF, but didn't account for participants' exposure to sunlight. I think this is a significant omission because the body naturally produces vitamin D when the skin is exposed to sunlight, and sunlight may have additional health benefits beyond simple vitamin D production. You can't get sunshine in a pill. This matters because sunshine exposure triggers the production of vitamin D, but also influences many other physiological processes, such as nitric oxide production, which can improve vascular health and reduce blood pressure, By the way, that's also why men tend to get erections when they sunbathe naked. These are potentially factors relevant to AF risk. By excluding sunlight, the study cannot determine whether vitamin D supplementation is as effective or more effective, or potentially even less effective than natural sunlight in reducing AF risk. And this matters because, as I said, sunlight is extremely beneficial. It's free, and of course, no pill to swallow. So, all that said, can we compare sunlight to vitamin D supplementation though? Can we work out the equivalent amount of sunshine to the international units that was used in the study? Well, actually, no, we can't. It's very challenging to directly equate sun exposure to an international unit of vitamin D supplementation because the amount of vitamin D produced depends on multiple factors. So, skin type. Lighter skin produces more vitamin D in less time than people with darker skin. That's something we call the Fitzpatrick skin type. Now, we can probably assume, as it was in Finland and it's a predominantly white population, they probably have a type 1 or type 2 skin type, but assumptions can be wrong. It wasn't listed in the study. Latitude. In Finland, where the study was conducted, sunlight is insufficient, probably to also produce vitamin D during the winter months, making supplementation for much of the year actually necessary. Like England, where I grew up, they often have this condition called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD for short, and it really is a sad illness. You basically get depressed and unhealthy because you don't see the sun for a very long period of time. Come to think of it, probably a lot of the people across the world have this now, including in Australia. Time of the day and the season also matters. Midday sun in the summer produces by far the most vitamin D compared to sun at other times of the day. And of course, clothing and sunscreen usage. These can significantly reduce the amount of vitamin D generated from sunlight. Now, having said all of that, estimates suggest that maybe 10 to 30 minutes of midday sun on bare skin in the summer can produce around 10,000 to 20,000 units of vitamin D, totally eclipsing the supplementation used in this study. But as I said, that does depend very strongly on those factors, including how much you expose your body. But those levels of exposure are very difficult in places like Finland, or as I said, in Australia, where we're told to avoid the sun and cover up every square inch of our body to reduce the risk of skin cancer. And by the way, if you want me to do an episode on skin cancer, sun, and diet, let me know in the comments, or get in touch with me by email at mail@themeatmedic.com. I'll very happily make that video. So, number 2, vitamin D supplementation versus sunlight's additional benefits. Well, supplementation only provides vitamin D, whereas sunlight offers other potential cardiovascular benefits. For example, improved circadian rhythms. Exposure to natural light regulates sleep-wake cycles, which are really important for overall health and may influence heart rhythm. Nitric oxide release. As I mentioned, sunlight exposure increases nitric oxide levels, promoting vasodilatation and reducing blood pressure. Mood and stress can be affected by sunlight. Sunlight is known to boost serotonin levels, which may help to reduce stress and its impact on heart health. By focusing solely on supplementation, unfortunately, the study missed a golden opportunity here to compare these broader effects of sunlight against supplementation alone. But it's difficult to do a randomized controlled trial with sunlight, but they could have used UV light. So, what are the practical real-world implications of this? Well, given the widespread use of the Slip Slop Slap campaign in Australia, and I'm sure similar sun avoidance campaigns globally, I think it's pretty important to understand whether supplementation alone is enough to replicate the benefits of sun exposure. So supplementation can affect vitamin D deficiency, of course, but it doesn't give you the full spectrum of benefits associated with sunlight. For individuals in high sunlight regions, maybe moderate sunlight would actually be a much better, much more viable alternative to supplementation. I personally think, yes, it probably is, but that wasn't studied. Is there maybe an optimal balance between safe sun exposure and supplementation, particularly for those at risk of AF? Again, I think yes, but you have to be healthy or you will get sunburn much more easily. Not related to this study, but an interesting anecdote is how people following the carnivore diet, quote unquote, don't burn anymore. Now, of course, they do burn in intense sun, but far less easily than they used to. I've experienced this, I still experience it, and it's widely, repeatedly reported. This is almost certainly due to the elimination of seed oils from the diet, but I'm digressing slightly. Now, if you're watching on YouTube or listening in the car to the podcast, why should you care about people in Finland taking vitamin D tablets? Well, I already mentioned reducing the risk of AF is pretty damn important. AF is a very dangerous and it's very serious risk for increased morbidity, that's disease and dysfunction and disability, but also mortality, in other words, death. If you're over 60 and you're concerned about heart rhythm issues, ensuring you're getting adequate vitamin D levels might just be a very simple step towards reducing your risk. My recommendation personally would be sunshine, but vitamin D supplementation is what was studied here, and it probably is a very good start. Aim for 10 to 30 minutes, maybe just 10, of midday sun on exposed skin a few times a week, depending on your skin type, location, and season, and how much you're exposing of your skin. The more the better. Be mindful of overexposing yourself though, and maybe increasing the risk of skin cancer. But in simple terms, if the sun feels like it's burning your skin, it's probably burning your skin. And for those unable to get sufficient sun exposure, supplementation is probably a good idea and in fact probably necessary. Common recommendations for maintenance doses range from about 600 to 1,000 international units a day, but higher doses like those used in the trial, which 1,600 to 3,200, are probably more appropriate for most people, and they don't really require any kind of medical oversight or supervision. There can, however, be issues with too higher doses. You can get vitamin D toxicity. So whilst vitamin D is essential for many bodily functions, including calcium regulation, bone health, and of course now maybe heart rhythm stability, like any supplement, too much can be harmful. Vitamin D toxicity is very rare, otherwise known as hypervitaminosis D, but it's important to understand what constitutes a toxic dose and its potential consequences and, of course, symptoms. Now, sources vary on what is exactly considered a toxic dose. Some studies would suggest as low as 4,000 units a day, which I think is frankly ridiculous. Others would suggest 10,000 a day for months may possibly be sufficient to give a toxic dose. At 3,000 to 5,000 units a day, I think you're extremely unlikely to get vitamin D toxicity. But what are the symptoms of vitamin D toxicity? How do you know if you have it? Well, vitamin D toxicity mainly leads to hypercalcemia, this condition where calcium levels in the blood rise dangerously. This happens because vitamin D increases calcium absorption from the gut, and it also reduces its excretion from the kidneys. Early symptoms of this include nausea, vomiting, and poor appetite. Fatigue and weakness might also follow, as well as frequent urination and dehydration. Much more severe symptoms include confusion and irritability. Kidney stones or kidney damage can also happen, and calcification of soft tissues like blood vessels, hearts, lungs, and kidneys can also lead to organ dysfunction. Potentially life-threatening complications can happen if it's left untreated, but thankfully, it's very rare. Overall, I think this study was a really interesting one, and once again, it highlights the importance of maintaining proper nutritional status and nutritional balance within the body. For me, the big takeaway here is vitamin D equals sunshine, and more sunshine is generally better. What we've seen here basically is vitamin D is essential for overall health. I think most of us probably knew this, but it's not a magical solution. Heart health, and particularly the prevention of conditions like AF, requires a comprehensive approach. This includes maintaining a balanced diet, staying physically active, managing stress, and addressing those other risk factors like high blood pressure or obesity. Vitamin D supplementation can be a valuable part of the equation, especially for those at significant risk of vitamin D deficiency, but it should always be used wisely and not haphazardly. So what can you do today to support your heart health and optimize your vitamin D levels? Well, first off, get your vitamin D levels checked. Fairly straightforward. Find out if you're deficient or not. Ask your healthcare provider for a blood test to measure your vitamin D. This will help determine if supplementation is needed and at what dose. The next is to get some balanced sun exposure and balance it possibly with supplementation. Aiming for moderate, safe sunlight exposure could naturally boost your vitamin D levels. If you're in a low sunlight region or avoiding the sun otherwise, which I wouldn't do, but if you're doing that, talk to your doctor about supplementation. Then think about prioritizing other heart healthy habits, like incorporating regular exercise, a nutrient-rich diet like keto or carnivore, and stress management also. Put these into your routine. These are all proven ways to further reduce your risk of AF and other cardiovascular issues.